Much of the cutting that we do on projects is all straight lines. But what about when you want to make a perfect circle? Well, there's two ways to do that. One is with a router and one's with the bandsaw. And I'd like to show you different techniques to accomplish both those circle cutting processes. The way to do this with a hand router is by using a trammel. And a trammel is simply a pivot point that the router circles around to create whatever diameter circle you want. The pivot point in this case is just a screw. And what we've used for a trammel is a couple pieces of round bar stock. We inserted them into a piece of hardwood, and what you're doing then is measuring between the edge of that pivot point, that little screw head, right to the outside edge of the router bit. Gives me an 8-inch radius, which will give me a 16-inch circle. Tightening a couple of screws down on either side will hold that trammel in position. And then what we're going to do is cut a piece of plywood. Now the plywood, to make sure that I've secured it, I put a couple of pieces of double stick tape on the back edge. They will be taped down to a sacrificial board. I put a piece of MDF over the top of my workbench. I'm going to make multiple cuts in here, lowering the bit by about 1/8 of an inch each time. It's much easier on the router and gives a much cleaner cut. But ultimately, I want to cut about a 1/16 of an inch or so into that substrate material, and I don't want that to be the bench. So I've made those little spots of tape on the bottom side. They'll fit and hold that piece of wood really well. Now our stock is firmly attached to this piece of substrate. That way I'll make sure that I can kind of protect my bench. I've drawn diagonals across the front of it to locate the center, and that's where we're going to put our pivot pin. Before we start routing though, I'd like to talk a little bit about the router bits. The bit we've got on there now is a straight bit, and we're going to make multiple passes, again lowering that bit about 1/8 of an inch. But this is plywood. So we're going to be very careful when we do that, because occasionally plywood has a tendency to chip on there, and a straight bit, because it's cutting in a straight angle all the way around, has a tendency to chip. There are other bits that you can use that will greatly reduce that chip. Now the one that you see here is also a straight bit. It's a little bit larger than the one that's on here. It's a 1/2-inch shank, and you can see that the cutter is straight up and down. So as I cut, I'm cutting in a perfect circular motion. The bit that I've got here, as you turn it, you'll still notice something a little bit different. As I turn this, you'll see the rings actually start going up. This is called an upcut spiral. As it cuts into the wood, it actually pulls the sawdust back up out of there. This is really nice when cutting mortises. When you want to get that material out, you don't want to trap the sawdust in the mortise. The problem is, on a piece of material like this, that upcut has a tendency to really chip the wood. The last bit is called a downcut spiral. As I turn this, you'll notice that the spiral is actually cut down, almost like the way a screw bit would go. And as it's cutting down, it actually pushes and cuts into the wood. It'll reduce, if not eliminate, all the chipping on the outside. Now these bits are more expensive. If you're doing an awful lot of work in plywood and you want to all but eliminate the chance of chip out, a downcut spiral may not be a bad thing for you. We're going to use a standard bit here. You'll get a chance to see what it does, and in most cases a standard bit should fit the type of work that you're doing. Now we're going to set this at the middle of our little mark, so I make sure that it's in the right spot. Fasten the screw down, that'll give me a good pivot point. And then route. And you'll notice that the trammels are pretty long here, so we're going to have to swing them around, but this particular set of trammels is probably a little over 20 inches long, so that would do a 40-inch diameter circle, so a pretty big thing, showing you something just to get the idea. And again, we're going to lower that bit about 1/8 of an inch per pass. And now we have a perfect 16-inch circle. Again, nice, easy passes, about 1/8 of an inch each time until you finally pierce this, and a little bit of cut into the substrate material provides a nice clean edge. I do have something I want to add to this too. I was doing a project in my own home quite a while ago where I had to create a ring like this for a circular frame. And I did it the same way with a router and a trammel, but there is one little trick to it. If I were going to do this and if I were explaining it to you, I would set this up the same way, and this particular one that I cut it out of is a piece of hardboard. I set my pivot point the same way, but if I want to cut this ring, I'd make sure that I cut the outside radius first and then cut the inside radius. If you cut the inside radius first, there's a chance that you'll get a little bit of a shift, and when you go to try and cut the outside radius, you won't have a concentric ring. So if you're planning on doing these, and this is a great way to make circular frames, make sure that you make your outside radius first, then cut to your inside radius. You can always later put a small rabbited groove around the inside edge here to hold your glass and stop, but this is a great way to make these trim rings too. Works really well. Now if you're planning on cutting small circles, you're better off using a bandsaw. Real small circles may be somewhat impractical for a router, and on a bandsaw they work really well, as long as they can be paired with a little jig like this. Now, this is a shop-made jig, really easy to do. A couple of pieces of 3/4 inch plywood or MDF with a rabbet cut on the corners. And we've complemented that with a sliding bar with rabbets on those edges. So this moves in and out of a groove that was created by taking these 2 pieces of plywood and gluing them to a little bit of a substrate. Now I've put cleats on the outside edge of these. They match the table we're planning on using them with. And then a small cleat on the bottom edge here that fits into the slot on your bandsaw table. So it's an extremely secure little jig. One of the last things we did was put an 1/8 inch pivot rod at the top here. Any tiny little bar stock works well for that. And an adjusting screw that can be screwed down here to hold this bar in place. And the way this works is all we do is measure from the point of this pivot rod to the face of that blade, and that gives us the radius of the circle we're planning on cutting. And by using a piece of scrap, you can do your original layouts. I put a diagonal on the back side of this, a drill hole in the center, a nice shallow one to fit over that pin. After I place it on that pin, I move it up to the shortest edge and right up against the blade. Take this off, retighten that screw, which will hold this bar nice and tightly then. And then when I turn on the bandsaw, all I'm going to do is make a circular motion into those teeth. It works really well. Let me show you exactly what I'm talking about. Okay, I've attached on the pin. The object now is to slide the bar up until it just touches the face of that saw blade. So I know that that's the position I want it in. So now I can tighten down my adjusting screw. Replace the piece. And cut it. It's important to run a nice slow feed into that blade. You'll get the cleanest cut. You won't be forcing the blade. You won't get any deflection. Now the piece that we cut on there is a nice perfect circle. There are some bandsaw marks on the side, which you would expect, so those have to be sanded off. If you find that the circle's a little bit larger than you wanted, slide your pivot pin and assembly a little bit closer to the edge and you got it. Now what you're going to find in many cases is, as you cut around the wood, the top edge is going to be nice and clean because the blade is cutting straight down at it. But on the back side, there's going to be a bit of chip out. The slower the feed speed, the finer the blade and the sharper the blade will reduce a lot of that, though it may not eliminate it all. But the one thing that you may find is on plywoods, the chip out can be more pronounced. There'll be almost none as it follows the ply, but as it comes across the face of the ply, there's going to be some, and that's just one of the things that you're going to find. This, remember, is always on the bottom. The suggestion is that a real light sanding will clean off the edges, and maybe a slight 45-degree chamfer around the bottom side reduce a lot of that chip out. But the issue is, it's a great little jig, great way to make smaller pieces like this, and you can make them almost any diameter with an off-board brace. You can make them almost as large as you want. a great jig, something that you really need to make, and you'll actually enjoy making circles.